The town isn't just trapping people. It may be erasing them. Every time someone gets close to understanding what from really is, something happens that destroys the evidence. Memories become unreliable. Stories disappear. People forget details they should never forget. And the town seems to replace the missing pieces with something else. That means the strangest thing about this place may not be the monsters. It may be the town's ability to control history itself. And if that is true, then the events we thought were random tragedies may actually be part of one repeating system. A system designed to make sure nobody remembers the truth long enough to escape it. Look at what the show is actually telling us. From the beginning, the town has behaved like a place that refuses to preserve its own past. People arrive with almost no understanding of how they got there. Previous residents leave behind fragments instead of complete explanations. Objects survive, but their meanings become unclear. Stories are passed down, but rarely in a form that can be completely trusted. And this is where the theory begins. The town doesn't simply hide its history. It actively erases and reshapes it whenever someone gets too close to the truth. That changes the meaning of almost everything. Because if the town can interfere with memory, then forgetting something is no longer harmless. It becomes evidence. Think about how often characters struggle to explain what they have experienced. They remember pieces, images,
sounds,
symbols, dreams,
names,
but rarely the complete picture. And that pattern is too consistent to ignore. The town gives people enough information to keep them searching, but never enough to let them finish the puzzle.
Why?
Because a mystery can protect itself better than a wall ever could. If you lock someone inside a room, they know they are imprisoned. But if you erase their memory of the door, they may spend years searching for an exit that was always beside them. That's not the real mystery. The real mystery is who decides what the people are allowed to remember. And this is where the older events become much more disturbing. Take Victor. For decades, Victor has carried memories of the town that nobody else could possibly possess. But even Victor's memories are incomplete. He remembers children. He remembers death. He remembers places. He remembers terrifying events from his childhood. Yet there are enormous gaps. And those gaps matter. Because Victor's survival should have made him the perfect witness. Instead, he became something closer to a damaged archive. A living record with missing pages. That may not have happened because he was simply traumatized. It may have happened because the town needed him to forget. And this detail changes how we should look at his behavior. Victor has spent years collecting objects and drawing pictures. At first, this looks like a coping mechanism. But what if it is actually something more important? What if Victor instinctively understands that memory cannot be trusted? He draws because he knows his mind can lose things. He saves objects because objects cannot forget. That makes his room almost look like an underground archive, a museum of things the town failed to erase. And perhaps that is why Victor is so important. He isn't just someone who survived. He is one of the few remaining connections to an earlier version of the town. But here's what changes everything. If Victor represents preserved history, then the town may have been trying to destroy that history for decades. And we can see the same pattern in other characters. People discover symbols and strange locations, but the meaning constantly changes. A tree can represent hope, then danger, then something much older. A nursery rhyme can sound meaningless, then suddenly become a clue. A dream can look psychological, then reveal information the person could not logically know. The town keeps taking familiar things and changing what they mean. That suggests the residents are not simply uncovering a mystery. They are uncovering layers of erased history. And every layer makes the previous one look incomplete. That is exactly how a controlled history would work. You don't need to destroy every piece of evidence. You only need to destroy the connection between the pieces. Let someone remember the symbol. Let someone else remember the location. Let another person remember the death. But make sure none of them can understand that all three events belong to the same story. Suddenly, everyone has a clue. Nobody has the truth. And this may explain why the town feels like it has existed forever. Because perhaps it has. Not physically, but through repetition. The same fears, the same roles, the same discoveries, the same mistakes. The same attempts to escape. The town may not need to invent new victims. It may simply need to make new people repeat an old story. And if the story repeats, then history becomes a weapon. This is the detail everyone missed. The residents are constantly trying to understand where they are. But perhaps that is the wrong question. The better question is, what happened here before we arrived? Because if the town is erasing its own history, then every new group of survivors begins with the same disadvantage. They arrive believing they are the first. They are not. They are simply the latest people to enter a story that was already happening. And the reason nobody can fully prove it may be the most terrifying part. The evidence doesn't necessarily disappear. The memory connecting the evidence disappears. That means the town doesn't have to kill every person who discovers the truth. It only has to make sure the truth becomes impossible to reconstruct. And if Season 4 is pushing this idea further, then the biggest threat may no longer be the creatures walking through the forest. It may be the town itself deciding what its people are allowed to remember. Because if that power exists, then escaping the town isn't enough. You would have to escape with your memories intact. And that may be something the town has never allowed anyone to do. But there is one character who may prove this theory is much bigger than memory. And once we look at what happened to him, the entire history of the town starts to look less like a mystery and more like a carefully repeated experiment. The most terrifying possibility is that the town doesn't erase history randomly. It erases history selectively. And if that is true, then every missing memory, every forgotten detail, and every incomplete story becomes suspicious. Because maybe the town isn't trying to make everyone forget everything. Maybe it only wants them to forget the things that connect the past to the present. And once you see that pattern, one character becomes impossible to ignore.
Jade.
Jade's obsession with the symbols has always looked like a search for an answer. But look closer at what actually happens whenever he gets closer to understanding them. He doesn't receive a clean explanation. He receives fragments. A vision, a symbol, a strange image, a historical connection. Then another contradiction. It is almost as if the town is allowing Jade to remember just enough to continue searching while preventing him from forming the complete picture. And this is where it gets darker. What if the symbols aren't simply clues? What if they are memory anchors? Something designed to survive even when the human mind cannot. That would explain why Jade keeps returning to them. His mind may not understand what they mean, but something inside him recognizes that they are important. The symbol survives. The memory around the symbol doesn't. And that distinction could be the key to the entire mystery. Because the town may have been doing this for generations. Destroy the context. Preserve the trigger. Then wait for someone new to rediscover it. That creates a horrifying cycle. Someone finds the symbol. They become obsessed. They uncover another piece. They get closer to the truth. Something happens. The trail breaks. The next generation begins again. Same mystery. Different people.
Same town.
Different memories. But there's another clue hiding in plain sight. The way people experience visions. From repeatedly blurs the boundary between memory, dream, hallucination, and supernatural information. Normally, that would make the characters unreliable. But what if the opposite is true? What if the visions are the only moments when the erased history leaks back through? Think about how dangerous that would make dreams. A dream is normally something produced by your own mind. But in From, dreams can contain information that feels external. Images that don't belong to the person's normal experience. Places they shouldn't know. Events they couldn't have witnessed. And if the town controls conscious memory, perhaps dreams become the loophole. The conscious mind forgets. The subconscious remembers. That would explain why the truth keeps returning in distorted forms. Not as explanations. As nightmares. As symbols. As impossible images. As fragments that feel meaningless until another event gives them context. But here's what changes everything. If the town cannot completely erase memory, then it has to keep people confused about what their memories mean. And that may be exactly what the supernatural forces are doing.
They don't always need to lie.
They only need to make the truth impossible to interpret. Imagine remembering a room, but forgetting why it matters. Remembering a person, but forgetting when you met them. remembering a song but forgetting who taught it to you. The information survives. The connection disappears. That is a much more sophisticated form of control. And it could explain why the residents repeatedly discover information that feels familiar. They aren't necessarily discovering something for the first time. They may be remembering something they were forced to forget. Now look at the town itself. The buildings don't feel completely random. The diner, the church, the houses, the clinic, the sheriff's office, the tunnels, the strange structures in the forest. Each location feels like it belongs to a larger system. But nobody has a complete map of how that system works. And that may be intentional, because if the town is a machine, then the residents only see individual components. They see a lighthouse. Someone else sees the forest. Someone else sees the tunnels. Someone else experiences the monsters. Someone else sees the children. Nobody sees the entire mechanism. That fragmentation protects the system. And this is where Victor becomes even more important. Victor doesn't just remember the past. He remembers it emotionally. His reactions often appear disconnected from the explanations other characters want. He knows certain places are dangerous before he can explain why. He reacts to certain objects as though they carry memories that words cannot capture. That makes him different from someone simply telling a story. Victor may be carrying something closer to procedural memory. His body remembers what his conscious mind cannot fully explain. And that could be why his instincts repeatedly matter. The town may have erased pieces of his narrative memory, but it failed to erase everything. Some things remained.
Fear.
Habit. Images. Drawings. Patterns. That is why his drawings could be more important than any spoken explanation. Words can be forgotten. A picture can preserve a pattern. And if Victor has spent decades drawing the same kinds of images, perhaps he has unknowingly been documenting the town's attempts to rewrite itself. But there is an even darker possibility. What if the town doesn't only erase the memories of individuals? What if it erases historical continuity itself? That would mean every generation enters a world where the previous generation's discoveries have already been buried. Not necessarily destroyed. Buried. Hidden beneath new stories. New buildings. New symbols. New victims. And if that is happening, then the town's age becomes almost impossible to determine, because every attempt to establish a timeline can be contaminated. Someone remembers one event. Another person remembers a different version. Objects suggest one period. Stories suggest another. The supernatural makes normal chronology almost meaningless. And that may be exactly how the town protects itself. Because if you cannot establish what happened first, you cannot understand what caused what. You can't determine the beginning. And without the beginning, you can't identify the original mistake. That's not the real mystery. The real mystery is whether the town needs people to forget its beginning. Because maybe the beginning is the one piece of history that could destroy the entire system. Think about the monsters. For years, the survivors have treated them as the immediate threat. They come at night. They hunt. They manipulate. They imitate familiar people. They know how to psychologically torture their victims. But what if the monsters are not the creators of the cycle? What if they are its maintenance system? Their job may not simply be to kill. Their job may be to keep people afraid enough that they never have the time or stability to reconstruct the past. Every night becomes survival. Every morning becomes damage control.
Food.
Medicine. Missing people. Broken relationships. New threats. New deaths. There is never enough peace to sit down and compare decades of evidence. And that could be the genius of the system. The town doesn't need to erase every memory itself. It creates enough chaos that humans erase each other's memories naturally. Trauma fragments stories. Fear changes perception. Deaths remove witnesses. And survivors become too exhausted to investigate. So the supernatural force doesn't merely attack the body. It attacks the ability to build a coherent history. Now, imagine what happens if someone finally breaks that pattern. If a group of survivors manages to collect the drawings, the symbols, the dates, the locations, the visions, the stories from older residents, the strange objects, everything, and they put it together. For the first time, the town would have a problem. because history would become stronger than memory. The past could no longer be erased one person at a time. And that may explain why the closer the characters get to the truth, the more aggressively the town seems to respond. The phenomenon isn't protecting a location. It's protecting a story. A story that must remain incomplete. And if the characters finish it, they may finally understand why they were brought there. But here's the terrifying part. What if finishing the story doesn't mean escaping? What if understanding the past is exactly what activates the next stage? Because perhaps the town doesn't erase history to hide what happened. Perhaps it erases history to prevent the survivors from discovering that they have already been part of it before. And if that's true, then the question isn't simply, why can't they remember? The question becomes, what are they going to remember when the town finally stops hiding it? Because whatever comes back may not feel like a discovery. It may feel like a memory. And that would mean the most horrifying revelation in From isn't waiting somewhere in the forest. It may already be inside the characters' minds. But if the town really is erasing its own history, then there is one final piece of the puzzle we have to confront.
Why?
Why would a place go to such extreme lengths to keep its past hidden? Why allow people to discover fragments, only to bury the answers again? Why preserve symbols while destroying their meaning? And why keep survivors alive long enough to investigate, instead of simply killing them? The answer may be that the town doesn't actually fear people discovering individual secrets. It fears them discovering the pattern. Because one secret can be survived. A pattern can be broken. And this is where everything we've seen begins to connect. The monsters may be terrifying. The forest may be impossible. The visions may be supernatural. But none of those things explain the strangest feature of From. The town constantly creates situations where people are forced to repeat old behavior without realizing they are repeating it. Someone investigates. Someone warns them. Someone ignores the warning. Someone discovers something underground. Someone follows a vision. Someone tries to save another person. Someone pays the price. Then the cycle continues. Different faces. Same emotional roles. Same kinds of choices. Same consequences. That suggests the town isn't just preserving a location. It's preserving a story structure. And if history is being erased, perhaps the purpose is to make every generation believe their choices are new. Because if you knew that people before you had made the exact same decisions, you might choose differently. You might refuse the path. You might recognize the trap. You might understand what happens next. So the town takes away the one weapon that could defeat a repeating system: memory. That's why the idea of erased history is so important. History isn't just information. History is warning. If you remember what happened to the person before you, you can avoid becoming that person. But if you don't remember them, you repeat their mistake. And suddenly the town's cruelty becomes much more intelligent. It doesn't need to control every decision. It only needs to remove the consequences from people's memory. Then people willingly walk into the same trap. Look at Victor again. For decades, he has lived through the consequences of previous cycles. But he doesn't always understand the entire sequence. He carries pieces. He has instincts. He has drawings. He has emotional reactions. He remembers enough to survive, but not enough to explain everything. That may be why the town has never been able to completely defeat him. Victor represents imperfect memory. And imperfect memory is still dangerous, because even a fragmented record can eventually be reconstructed. That is exactly what the newer survivors are doing. They are collecting fragments Victor couldn't connect. They are finding information in places he never understood. They are asking questions he stopped asking decades ago. And slowly, something unprecedented may be happening. The town's history is being reconstructed, not remembered by one person, reconstructed by many. And that is a huge difference, because the town may be able to confuse one mind. It may be able to traumatize one survivor. It may even be able to destroy one witness. But what happens when 10 people remember different pieces of the same event? What happens when their memories overlap? What happens when one person's vision confirms another person's drawing? What happens when an object from the past matches a symbol from a dream? At that point, the town loses control over the narrative. The fragments become evidence. And evidence becomes history. That may be the real thread emerging in Season 4. Not another monster. Not another mysterious location. But the possibility that the survivors are finally becoming historians of their own prison. And here's where the theory becomes truly disturbing. If the town has been erasing its own history for generations, then perhaps the previous survivors weren't failures. Maybe they were almost successful. Maybe every cycle gets close to revealing the truth. And then something happens that destroys the chain of evidence.
A death.
A disappearance. A memory loss. A betrayal. A supernatural event. The survivors start again. This would explain why the town can feel both ancient and strangely familiar. It is constantly resetting its own narrative. The physical environment may remain, but the meaning changes.
The people change.
The explanations change. The names change. The story survives. And the people inside it forget that they've seen it before. That is a much more frightening version of the time loop idea. It doesn't require everyone to literally travel through time. It only requires the same story to repeat through different people. And that means escaping the town may require more than finding a road. It may require breaking the story itself. Because if the road leads back to the beginning, and the beginning has been erased, then every escape attempt is already part of the cycle. That's why the bottle trees, the symbols, the visions, the tunnels, the children, the monsters, and the strange locations may not be separate mysteries. They may be pieces of one enormous historical record. A record that the town keeps trying to destroy. But here's the final reframe. Maybe the town isn't erasing history because it wants nobody to know what happened. Maybe it is erasing history because history itself is the prison. The people aren't trapped simply because they cannot leave. They're trapped because they cannot remember enough to understand why they are there. And if the town can control memory, then even an escape could be meaningless. Imagine someone finally reaches the outside world. They survive. They return to normal life. But months later, they forget the town. Not immediately. Not completely. Just enough. The faces become blurry. The symbols become meaningless. The roads become difficult to remember. The nightmare becomes something they convince themselves never happened. And eventually, the town disappears from their life. But what if that is the real escape mechanism? What if people have escaped before? What if they simply forgot? That possibility would completely change the meaning of the phrase, nobody gets out. Maybe nobody gets out with the truth. And if someone did escape with their memories intact, they would be more dangerous to the town than any weapon, because they could tell the outside world. They could document everything. They could create records. They could preserve the history the town keeps destroying. And that may be why the supernatural system is so obsessed with confusion. Confusion protects secrecy. Fear protects secrecy. Death protects secrecy. But forgetting protects it forever. So when the characters experience visions, we shouldn't only ask what the vision predicts. We should ask what memory is trying to come back. When someone recognizes a symbol, we shouldn't only ask what the symbol means. We should ask, who knew this before them? When Victor reacts to something without understanding why, we shouldn't dismiss it as trauma. We should ask, what does his body remember that his mind cannot? And when the town produces another impossible mystery, we should stop assuming it is a new mystery. It may be an old one that has been erased, one that has returned, one that the characters have already faced in another form. And that leads to the most disturbing prediction of this entire theory. The biggest revelation may not be discovering what happened to the town. It may be discovering that the town's survivors have been rebuilding the same history over and over again. Every generation finds the clues. Every generation loses the connections. Every generation gets closer. And every generation forgets. Until now. Because this time, the pieces are beginning to connect. And if the town realizes that the survivors have finally reconstructed its history, it may have only one way left to protect itself. Erase the people who remember. Not the clues. Not the buildings. Not the symbols. The witnesses. Which means the final battle may not be about killing the monsters. It may be about remembering. Remembering every death. Every symbol. Every vision. Every warning. every person who came before. Because the moment the survivors can say, "This has happened before," the town loses its greatest advantage. And perhaps that is the one sentence it has spent centuries trying to make impossible. So the next time someone in From forgets something important, don't assume it's just trauma. Don't assume it's coincidence. Ask the more dangerous question. What if the town didn't make them forget because the memory was painful, but because the memory was true?